Kia ora tātou, ko te ahumairangi te maunga, ko te awa kairangi te awa, no haina me hongepua o ku tipuna, no te whanganuia tāra aho, ko Tis toku whānau, ko Chris toku ingoa. Kia ora, my name is Chris Tis, and I'm a writer and editor from Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator for this Enqueer session, the Queer Chronicles. Before I introduce the panel, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land both throughout Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, on which the panelists and myself live and create our work, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples watching this session. The focus of this panel is queer experience and how writing about it has changed over time, and I'm delighted to be joined by four wonderful writers who will each bring a unique perspective to this topic. Stephen House is an award-winning Australian playwright, poet, and actor. He has produced several short films, exhibitions, and plays that have toured nationally and internationally. His play Johnny Chico is currently touring Spain. He's won 2 Augie Awards, an Adelaide Fringe Award, the Rhonda Jankovic Poetry Award for Social Justice, the Goulburn Poetry Cup, and a Feast Short Story Prize. Liz Breslin has released 2 poetry collections, Alzheimer's and a Spoon, which was one of the New Zealand listeners' top 10 poetry books, and In Bed with the Feminists, which won the Kathleen Grattan Prize for a sequence of poems. In April 2020, she co-created the Possibilities Project with Dunedin UNESCO City of Literature, and as part of a 2021 UK residency, she has also written a collection, Nothing to See Here, about watching Norwich through a peregrine webcam. Jessie Jones is the editor and lead journalist of Pink Advocate and was formerly with Star Observer. Jessie has interviewed famous figures from politicians to porn stars, as well as using his platform to highlight voices from all parts of the LGBTQ+ community. Jessie has received the New South Wales Gender Centre's Valerie Award. And Barbarella Karpinski is a wordsmith chanteuse who has created written and spoken word, memoirs, and screenplays. Their live performances have been screened on SBS and the ABC. They completed new queer work run by Pact Theatre and the Performance Space, and wrote Tainted Life as part of the residency, Feminist Specificities Around the Outside. Welcome to the panel, and let's get straight into it. So although there are echoes and a common language, the queer experience, of course, is not singular nor tidy. It's a shape-shifting, multi-layered abstraction that is somehow both universal and intensely individual. Stories of queer lives and experiences are as varied as the people who live them. They are also stories that were once secret and taboo, some filled with shame, others filled with tragedy. But many of today's queer writers are claiming ground that was once taken from them and finding new ways to chronicle and celebrate their past, present, and everyday joy to momentous milestones. So we get to how the panelists have written the queer experience themselves. What sort of representations of queer and queer experience do they remember, and how did this influence how they expressed their queerness and themselves? Barbarella, would you like to kick things off?
Yeah, sure. What would you like me to talk about?
I guess you could talk about maybe the moment that you saw something in film or read it in a book or maybe on stage that was sort of like the aha moment for you.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, look, there's sort of many moments and they change, but yeah, I'd go to the geeky dawn in Welcome to the Dollhouse in Todd Solance's film. Yeah, she's an outsider. She gets beaten up at school. She's very big glasses, and she ultimately triumphs. So whether you call that queer, I don't know, but I'm rather fond of Dawn.
And Stephen?
Well, I guess I'm probably the oldest here by a long shot. So I have to go back to my 20s, which was a long time ago, and say that my experience, there was very little queer literature, performance, or anything around. It was kind of taboo and hidden. So I suppose one of my first experiences of identifying with queer writing as a playwright and theatre artist was I got right into reading Joe Orton. And who was a writer making work in the 60s. And I started reading everything that Joe Orton had ever written. And I was fortunate enough to see a small production, a warehouse production of a Joe Orton play. And in many ways, I suppose, it gave me permission to start writing down my stuff. And then I started exploring more queer playwrights. And even though they weren't writing a lot of queer stuff, it was people like Tennessee Williams, Noel Coward, that I started to read into their scripts and see their plays, and started to see the hidden gay characters within the straight characters, which was actually necessary in the 1940s and 50s to kind of mask your gay characters. So, yeah, I suppose I was really inspired by the great gay writers of the 40s, 50s and 60s. I don't know if that's answering the question, but, it gave me permission to write my first play and to actually document my queer life in that first play. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think we'll touch on that that theme of permission, I think, later on. But Liz, what about yourself? What was sort of the first moment, or the first queer media, or maybe not even queer media, like we've already sort of heard that straight sort of texts and things have those hidden characters. What was it that was the aha moment for you?
Oh, I love this question, to go back through those. So I had a very religious upbringing, and I used to have to go to Carla's house to watch Dallas on a Wednesday night, because we weren't allowed to watch that sort of sinful thing at my house. And one time when I was over at her house, I saw this TV program, I guess it was a series, called Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. It was based on the Jeanette Winterson book, but I didn't know that at the time. And I was like, oh my God, this girl is me. And it was amazing to see that someone could not only be outwardly into girls, but also be into girls and be on the television. And I was like, what is happening here? So that was a real moment for me.
Great. And Jessie?
Well, I have always wanted to be a writer since I was a kid, and always known that I was some kind of queer, even before I understood it and before I had proper words for it. I was really into reading a lot of horror when I was a teenager, and a lot of what I kind of gravitated towards was really gay, queer, gothic stuff. Read a lot of Anne Rice, read a lot of stuff by Poppy Z. Bright, who is now an out trans man. And I think those were a lot of my kind of formative literary experiences. And one of my earlier memories is reading a copy of Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask that my parents had in the house. And I must have been about 7, probably wasn't meant to be reading it. I remember reading all about trans women in this book, and of course it didn't mention trans men. It's this very old book from about the 70s, I think. And recall thinking to myself, I wonder if this works the other way, that there are men trapped in women's bodies. And as a very young child, wondered whether that might have been me, and went, oh no, I don't think so. And about 25 years later, those thoughts came back. That's one of my earliest memories of something being very aha.
That's great. And what I've sort of really liked hearing from all of you is that you've sort of in a different way sort of just stumbled across some of these texts and films and TV programs without actually looking for them. So, Stephen, you mentioned permission. I was going to sort of ask you next, once you sort of saw these films and saw these books and these plays, how did they start to influence you in the way that you began to write about your own queer experience?
Yeah, I'm going to jump back a little bit. That something came to mind when everyone was talking and a lot of you younger people probably don't even remember it, but there was a TV show that was a huge hit in Australia called Number 96. It was like massive. It was absolutely huge. It was a soap that was on every night for half an hour. And there was a gay character in there called Joe. We're talking, I don't know, the early 70s probably. Late 60s.
I used to watch that. Yeah, I think it was in the 70s. Yeah.
Yeah, number 96. And there was a gay character in there called Joe, and I fell in love with him as a teenager. And I used to like switch on the TV every night and wait for Joe. And you know, in a lot of ways that actually I didn't know I was going to be a writer or an actor, but in a lot of ways, Joe gave me a little bit of permission to explore that part of me. And even though I moved into relationships with women and ended up becoming a father, and Joe was kind of with me a lot of that. And I'd go back because we're talking about a time that homosexuality was just so taboo. And, you know, to have Joe on TV was a really, really big thing. It was kind of controversial. So, yeah, that's kind of stepping back to that permission to even think about sexuality. But
I was rather fond of Abigail from number 96.
Abigail was really like, there was characters in there that you'll never forget, and Joe started going out with Dudley, and I just thought, like, fuck, I can't believe this, you know. It was so amazing. But in regards to permission to start creating work is you know, I was living in a tent in the middle of nowhere, surfing with a whole group of people and on the dole, and living a really hippie life in a hippie world. And I started kind of writing. I was starting to read some of the stuff. Like, I started to read a few Joe Orton plays, and this was really secret even from my friends. And I started writing kind of like secret poetry, and some of this poetry, you know, was about those innermost feelings. So that was kind of going back to some of the earliest ever permission to write and think about my queerness. But I suppose, you know, to conclude in regards to that question is, when I wrote my first play, it had been, and it had a strong, it had a bisexual character in there, and a trans character, and a gay guy comes to stay, and everything kind of erupts. And I suppose that play, I had permission to write that play because I was starting to read queer playwrights like Joe Orton, and that permission came about through reading, you know, gay playwrights. It gave me permission to write my own play.
Great. Barbarella, when I was sort of looking through some of the work that you've created, I kind of got the feeling that a lot of it's very, very fearless, and you don't seem to be the sort of person that would require permission to create a lot of that. But I wanted to maybe go back to that first moment where you started writing or creating work that was expressing your queerness, and how you took those first steps.
Well, you know, I wrote my first book when I was 4. Yeah, I stuck it together with sticky tape and Texticolor. So, yeah, you know, I don't really ever remember asking anyone permission for anything. But, yeah, but I think all the influences were that cerebral. I think Chuck Palahniuk, Stranger Than Fiction, you know, Life is Stranger Than Fiction is something that, you know, really sticks with me. I really love his writing and the underground and the kinky world. So, you know, I don't think it's about permission, but I think it's about feeling that you can write your lived experience as both an observer and as a participant. Yeah. And I think that's important. I think Chuck Palahniuk said all my books are about lonely people wanting to connect with each other. I wouldn't say my work's about that, but I think it's about individuated experience, but the collective experience. And yeah, and I was really strongly influenced by Jean Genet. In fact, when I did a performance for Wicked Women at the Imperial Hotel in that, I think it was around 1991, I wrote, I am the ghost of Jean Genet, come down to earth for some gender fuck in the body of a femme starlet.
And Jesse, as a journalist, you know, writing is a part of your work. But you know, what was that sort of moment when you first started to write about your own experience?
I've always been really into social media, being slightly younger person, I guess, when I was a young adult, Twitter, all those other sorts of platforms were just starting to pop up and become really popular. So a lot of my influences actually came from people just sharing these little snippets of their lives and experiences with each other online and yelling into the void about what they were experiencing. Um, so I think one of the earlier things that I can remember in terms of queer writing was just setting up this little anonymous Twitter account and sharing stories about what I was getting up to. As a queer person, as somebody that was starting to explore open relationships at that time in my life and having big, dirty, disgusting weekends and sharing those stories with people on that platform. That was one of the earliest things, I guess, that I wrote that was explicitly queer.
And that's a really
From there, I've moved.
that's a really public sort of forum to be doing something like that. And like, so did you get a lot of interaction through that?
Yeah, made a lot of other anonymous friends through Twitter. One of my good friends who I looked up to a lot, who I knew through Twitter, was a sex worker based in Adelaide who passed a few years ago, Grace Bellevue, who was quite well known and was a big advocate for sex worker rights and decriminalisation in South Australia. And her Twitter account was just incredible. She had so many followers and was just having the most incredible adventures every day and was this beautiful, openly bisexual, just absolute legend of a woman that did exactly what she wanted every day of her life. So I had a wonderful connection with her, loved reading what she was doing, and sort of aspired to be able to write like that and live like that.
That's great. And Liz, what about yourself?
In terms of permission?
Yeah, and permission, and also that moment where you first started to put that part of your life into your own writing.
I think poetry's always been really fundamental for that for me, because I think I said before, like growing up really religious and also being like in a couple of, I guess, abusive relationships where I've been like explicitly not allowed to be my queer self, which sounds really dumb when you're out of them, but it's actually really easy when you're in them, you know. It's always been a game of hide and seek until I guess the last, I want to say 5 or 6 years. And so I think I actually think that I still have to remember all the time that I have permission to write what it is that I want to write with the language that I want to write it. And it's all right. And it's still like, honestly, quite a joy to be able to do it. And like an extreme privilege as well, obviously. Yeah.
Jessie, you mentioned social media just before, and I wanted to ask you all about how community has played a part in your writing and creative processes, and particularly within the context of the queer communities. How has that sort of influenced how you write? And maybe, Barbarella, you could kick things off with this question.
Well, I don't know that there is really such a thing as the queer community as such. I think there's a lot of intersecting in like intertextual sort of communities and a lot of intersecting communities. Like I think my performance at Club Bend in the 90s at the performance space, I had like a show I used to do called I'm Too Beautiful to Be a Lesbian, and it was gay, lesbian, bi, straight, what's in a label anyway. It's not like it's Giorgio Armani or Christian Dior, but that was really about identity politics. And as someone who identifies as bisexual, and let me define that means having connections with people not based on gender and fluidity. You know, I feel like I've experienced a lot of discrimination, especially when I was younger, and still finding myself, even though I'm meant to be a 78er and trailblazer for the GLBTI community. I think it's just, in recent years I was part, like a few weekends ago, part of Biconic, and basically people think bisexuals are confused. Well, I've been bisexual for a really long time, and that's a pretty long time to be confused or sit on the fence. You can really sit on the fence only for so long. So I think it's about the perception of others, but I think the way community comes into it is just sometimes, you feel something yourself as an individual, and then years later, someone who hasn't even been born yet is born, has a life, and then validates that experience. So, I found it really rewarding to connect with people of all ages, especially the new generation of bisexuals, because I can validate my past and my present. So I think my thing is to bring the contemporary moment together with the past, and be here truly in the moment. But I don't think I really answered your question there about community.
No, that's great. I liked what you mentioned about connecting with the younger generation, and so that we can all learn from each other. Stephen, as someone who works in theatre, you collaborate with a lot of people. How, and you mentioned when you first started writing and reading plays, you did it in secrecy. But how did you sort of take that next step and sort of find people to work with?
Well, community played a really big part in my first productions, because I was working I was working in a few different roles with a theatre company and a great gay director, Jeff Crowhurst, who's passed away now. But he was a gay man, older than me at the time, and very, very wonderful man who saw a lot of stuff in me and encouraged me to move on with it. And I wrote my first play under encouragement from him. Gay community played a really, really big part in getting that first play on, because a whole lot of highly professional theatre workers that were working with mainstream companies came together. They were all gay, and they formed a company called Not So Straight Theatre in the early 90s to produce my first play, because going back to that time, they believed that with a play that was so queer and risky in a lot of ways in that time, that they would form this company specifically to produce a play that was queer and market it to the gay community. And so all of these incredible four great people, actually. One lives in Sydney now, Luke Cutler, Damien Carey, Jeff Crowhurst, and myself. We got together and we formed a company to produce my first play, and it was marketed entirely to the gay community. Remember, we're talking a time of no social media at all, or internet. So it was marketed to the gay community through print, through flyers and posters, and a very new gay press that was set up in Adelaide. And it was just a smash. And it was full of gays and lesbians and transgender people all coming out of the woodwork to see this play for them. And it was so exciting. And it probably wouldn't have ever happened had it not been for gay community. And I suppose now, all these many, many years later, 30 years later, gay community doesn't play such a big part in getting a play with queer issues on anymore, because we've mainstreamed a lot more. But, going back to that time, I believe that gay community, I have a lot to thank gay community for getting my work off the ground and out there in the public forum. The start of a feast festival in Adelaide, having a show in Mardi Gras and a play at Belvoir in Mardi Gras in the early days, it was very, very, very influenced and affected and supported by gay community. And I always think to myself when I have productions up and running now that, gay community played a massive part in my work getting off the ground. And, and in regards to supporting my queer writing. And so, gay community, LGBTQI community was massive for me in the beginning of putting work out. If that answers that, I don't know.
Yes. And Liz, you've recently done something called the Possibilities Project. I wonder if you could sort of talk about that and that sort of very collaborative sort of way of working in poetry.
Yeah. So, that wasn't in any specific way a queer project, other than that there we were doing it, but like the idea of that was actually taking a poem by Szymborska, who's a Polish writer, who was writing under a particular set of conditions where she couldn't say the things that she wanted to say were possible because she was writing under Stalinism, and we were writing in lockdown when a lot of things weren't actually possible, but we were writing about our own range of possibilities, I guess, in what we had. And so the challenge was for everyone to respond to Szymborska's work or some of the other work in the project. And so it went on with everyone talking about their possibilities. And so I guess in the framing of this, for me, that really was a queer endeavour, because that is what it's always about, right? Is what is possible. So yeah, it was a cool project. We thought it might take 3 weeks maybe, and we ended up with about 6 or 7 weeks worth of poems every day from people from like South Korea to Hungary, and it was a neat thing to be a part of.
And I think, if we did want to put this into a quick context as well, it's sort of like the first spark or the first seed that starts something, and then everything sort of just snowballs behind it, which is sort of what we've seen with some of the things that we've talked about already. Jesse, as a journalist, you are quite connected with the community through the work that you do. You write about other people's queer experiences and lives as well as your own. Do you find one easier to do over the other?
Oh, that's a good question. Certainly journalism is very much about community, and totally agree with Barbarella. We're not a monolith, the LGBTIQ plus community. There's many, many intersecting and different communities. I don't share about my own experiences so often these days. I'm very busy sharing other people's news and content. But I do like to write the odd opinion piece or essay about myself and share those sides of my own experiences from my life with readers. It's been really great since launching Pink Advocate a couple of years ago to be able to increasingly platform people from different parts of the community and different voices from all around the world, which is it's just been amazing. People from different parts of the community that cishet people may not even think of existing. The asexual community, non-binary people, intersex people, sex workers, all of the smaller groups within the community. I try to do my best to share content from as many of those groups and individuals as I can. Some of my international contributors have helped highlight some global issues that have been really important. And as the editor, it's really hit home for me, even that I've had to keep people anonymous in sharing their news because they're from parts of the world where it's totally unacceptable for them to be gay, trans, or anything else. So I've got a number of anonymous African correspondents whose names just can't be shared for their own safety, and that's been really enlightening, I think, for a lot of people.
And how...
Can I say Oh, sorry.
No, you got this.
No, I was just going to say on what you said there, Jessie, like, because I spent some time back in Poland, which is where my family's from, a couple of years ago. And I know from the people there as well, like queer friends there, just all they have is subtext because they're just not allowed to say anything out loud. And it's a really good reminder to me all the time that, like, look at the freedom I have here, you know, like, yeah.
Yeah, and Poland's been in the news lately with the LGBT free zones in all of
Yeah,
the
so they
local
just
government
got
areas
told
across the
they had
country.
to, yeah, they just got told by the European Union that they have to roll them back, but you know, no one's doing that very graciously, are they? So yeah, it's a pretty sad time out there. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, Chris.
No, that's all good. I guess on this topic, are there any boundaries that you have put up, either in the past or that you use today to protect yourself as a writer? And maybe are there any topics that you won't write about? Stephen?
I suppose there's not a lot of topics well, yeah, I suppose my own morals and attitudes and values to a degree affect what I'll write about. But I won't restrict my writing because of outside views. I'll probably I'll tell the stories I want to tell. Again, it's a lot different now. When I first started writing, I had a little boy, a son, and it was always quite high in the forefront that I didn't want to affect, because I used to get a reasonable amount of publicity about my work in the press, and I didn't want to do anything that would affect him at school, so he might get teased or like he was in the forefront always for me, and it restricted me. And so I would say if a journalist interviewed me, I remember being in a lift with a journalist from the Advertiser, a wonderful arts journalist, and I said to her, I'm just a little bit worried that something you might write might affect my son at school, and it's not about me, it's about him. And she was sensitive to that. And even though the play was it was about a transsexual sex worker in King's Cross, and I wrote it in King's Cross, and that now, 30 years later, is touring Spain under a different title. But she was really sensitive in not talking about my sexuality, talking more about the play than me. And so, yeah, in regards to restricting what I said about my work, I restricted it greatly because of my son. But that would have been about it. I've never, I've always gone cutting edge with my work, and I've never held it back in regards to, to queerness. I've pushed it out there big time, and I suppose that was quite noticed in my work initially, that it was very queer and it did take risks. So it was only personal things that affected what I put out, but not so much in my work, but put out in myself, really. If that makes sense.
Barbarella, what about you? Like any instances of self-censorship?
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said then.
Any instances of self-censorship that prevented you?
I don't think it's really self-censorship, but I might suffer for my art, but I don't think other people should have to. So as a journalist, I think it's I've often protected my interview subjects, and I think that's really important when you're sometimes I've stopped an interview because I felt like it wasn't helping the mental health of that person. So I often make a judgment call. I don't write about friends of mine who've suicided, especially if I've got private information that they've given me. I don't really feel I have the right to write about their lives when they're not here to say yay or no. And also, when I've interviewed people, I'm happy to talk about my sex work history, but it's not my job to come out, make other people come out. I think it's really important to consider the impact that coming out publicly or outing someone else may have on their life, and I think, one of my documentaries that I love the most, Night Trade, it's a journey of love, sex and war, and I really considered that, the interview subject really, I protected their identity because I felt that was the right thing to do. So I used voiceover, and I guard that quite. I really do try hard to protect my sources. I think that's a principle of integrity that I think, I as a journalist hold dear. As I said, I don't think other people should suffer for my art, and I don't think there's any prizes for sort of outing marginalised people and making their lives sort of worse. But, when it comes to myself, I've often used fiction. Like, I'll just read you a little bit. One of my characters, Ella, she's 20-something, bisexual, queer, identified, mysterious and elusive, a night worker who only ever alludes to what her job may be, a drug trader, an escort, a brothel worker, a writer, a poet, a striptease artist, or all of the above. She's vulnerable and beautiful, and beautiful in an indie sort of non-traditional way. So I suppose, when you're dealing with a non-supportive community, whether you're dealing with queer sex work or whatever, I think it is your job to protect both yourself and to protect other people. I don't, I think there's really sort of strong boundaries there. I don't know if that answers the question.
And there's like a lot of your work sort of uses memory as a recurring motif, and your first book was about your family and Alzheimer's, and your second book sort of is somewhat more personal. How did you navigate that shift, and how did you sort of like free yourself up to write about some of those things in your second book?
I think it helped that I'd left the relationship that I was in by the time the second book came out, which meant, a lot less self-preservation and self-censorship in that space, which was great. I mean, that's personally speaking. I don't know if one of the books really relates to the other though, Chris. Like, they were very they were kind of very different endeavors anyway. Like, they did, one did go into like the family memory, and the other one, I did give myself permission to be a lot more personal in it, I think. There was that. I like Stephen, what you were saying about your son, because I that is where I would go as well with my kids, that I do not speak about them like without their permission as well. And it's real, like, I really love navigating that as well, because they're old enough that they're on a lot of social media as well, so sometimes they play their lives out really publicly, like you were saying, Jessie, like all the really like public. It's so brilliant to be able to do that, and then but also it's really great to be able to take a step back and say, no, this is just for us, this is not for anyone else. And I love being able to do that with them as well, sort of like decide what to censor and what to keep for ourselves and what to put out there. And
something you just said. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, sorry, to wrap that back to what you were saying, Chris. I guess that's the game I was playing in both those books separately. That's the game you're always playing with poems, right? Is what am I going to play out in these? What am I going to play out in these moments? And I'm interested in that. Yeah.
I had a moment like relating in regards to what we're talking about being parents. Something that I hold really dear is I'll never forget this conversation. My son's 36 now, but when he was about 8 or 9 years old, and I had this really risky play opening and a lot of interviews and a lot of press about it. It was super risky. It was so queer, so risky, one of the riskiest things I'd done in that time. And And I was sat down, I was with my son, and we had a hot chocolate after kicking the ball in the park, and he was like 8 or 9 years old, and I'd always come out to him. I'd been completely honest about my sexuality to my son from when he was 6, 7 years old. And I said to him, look, I'm just really concerned because this play that's going to open is getting a lot of coverage, and a lot of stuff is going to be mentioned about sexuality and maybe my sexuality. And I'm just really frightened you're going to get some flack. And, you know, the beauty and innocence and acceptance of childhood. He just looked me in the eye really seriously and he said, Dad, you do what's right for your play. I'll look after myself. And, you know, it's just a really beautiful human thing that says so much about the innocence and acceptance of childhood that does get tarnished by other things. And he always continued having that attitude about my work and still does, still comes and sees my shows and still is so accepting about the honesty that, you know, going back to permission, I suppose that was one of the biggest permission things I'd ever had, that my little boy, who I love so much, gave me permission to be who I was and say what I wanted to say. And I think that's an incredibly special thing in my life. And probably that was the biggest permission I ever had, was from my own son, to write and be and do and say whatever was me. And mind you, my partner at the time, my son, thought was fabulous. So that might have had some effect as well.
That's a really lovely story about acceptance, particularly from someone that is so close to you. I just wondered if you could all talk about, maybe, for me, being a queer writer often means sort of coming out constantly, either in person to new audiences or through my work to people who aren't necessarily familiar with me or my background. Have there been any other instances, positive or negative, where the response has been quite surprising or stuck with you? Maybe, Jessie, you could start here.
I think that's the thing a lot of people outside of the queer community don't understand about coming out, is that you don't just make a coming out announcement and then you're out. It is potentially every person you interact with in the day, you either do or don't come out to. I've not had any real bad experiences, and I've never really made a big deal of coming out to people, particularly coming out as queer. Since being very young, I've always just presented myself as I am. I never felt the need to sit anybody down about it. Speaking of children, the 6-year-old in my life, I've never had a big discussion with, but he knows that Uncle Jesse has got a boyfriend and it's just normal to him. And I think kids now are more and more accepting of this kind of diversity. I'm really not much of a self-censorer. I am very out and open about things, and I write about, when I do write about myself personally, I share a lot. I'm open about being a sex worker and my trans journey. I've published pieces about what surgery is like as a person going through transition. The first time I got chlamydia, I wrote an opinion piece about it for Star Observer that was published nationally. So I really don't have much of a filter for myself.
And Liz, you mentioned earlier that, you know, it's only really been in the last 5 or so years that you've sort of been expressing yourself in this way. What sort of response have you had?
I mean, I think small town Wanaka, which is, for those of you not in New Zealand, is like this very small, rich place full of like lots of white conservative people. That's basically it, right? Is we put on this pantomime once which I wrote, where Cinderella married the gardener instead of the prince. You know, the gardener was called Rose, and someone threatened, literally threatened to come around and kill me. And that was a little bit out of proportion, I thought, for the subject matter, perhaps. But, perhaps he doesn't watch television either. So I feel, where am I going with this? I know there was a question. I feel like that for where I was living, I mean, even coming to Otipoti now, coming to Dunedin, is like coming to the big city. So where I was living for a lot of years in a very small town outside a very conservative place, I did not have a lot of queer media. I had books, I had anything that was on television, I had my Pink Label subscriptions to the most ethical porn I could find there. I had all those things going on, but I didn't be able to walk into the street or, go to the big, I'd have to go to the big cities, to consume anything queer at all. It was yeah. So to go back to whether that was all the queer things that happen in the small town have the big ripple, because they just don't have the I'm sure it's there, they just don't, I don't know, they're just all too busy doing sports or something in activewear instead, and they don't it's so different. Yeah, it's so different. Yeah.
I think they need people to open their minds up a little bit more.
Well, I mean, yes. Well, and that is the thing of being in a very small place, as opposed to, being in the city, the big city, or even now, in the small city. I can't tell you what a difference it makes to my life.
Barbarella, you've done a lot of work on some very big platforms like Mardi Gras. What sort of responses have you had?
I get a variety of responses, but often I polarize people. People tend not to sort of sit on the mid ground with me. They have one extreme or another. I suppose the most negative experiences I have is talking about queer sex work at, university, and I've found that I got quite negative responses there, and get misunderstood a lot. But really, I think it's about being able to tell your story in your words. And I think self-publishing can give you a lot of options there. You're not going through the gatekeepers, but that's what gives me the most personal satisfaction. And I suppose I sort of go back to people like, excuse my pronunciation, David Wanowitz, and Close to the Knives, A Memory of Disintegration. He was a hustler, and he spoke about that experience. So I think it's really about speaking about your own lived experience with your perceptions, and maybe with those people who have similar or shared experiences. And you just can't predict how other people are going to respond, but you will be censored. A lot of people have tried to censor me, and not give you those opportunities, not give you those platforms, or describe your work as bizarre. One university tutor speaking about queer sex work. So I think people who don't have your lived experience will love to judge you, will love to polarize you, will love to malign you. That's sort of their platform. So I'm a big believer that if you have a certain lived experience, it's your right to talk about that. You don't really have the right to talk about other people. And I think a lot of popular culture is let's find the marginalized person and interview them and laugh at them. And I don't really think that's a format for great television. But the right to tell your story in your words, I think there's something really awesome about that.
Yeah. And I was just reading an essay that you'd written for Runway Journal, where you talked about success and failure, and you said your work may only be known in the alternative culture world. Do you think there is now a growing mainstream acceptance of queer stories and queer lives in media?
I don't think it's really about acceptance. Like, I think, you know, if you look at something like Paris is Burning, and you look at the dance scene in New York, and you look at Jenny Livingston, I think, you know, if something's good, it's going to be appropriated by the mainstream. It doesn't really give you any more rights. It just makes you more commercial. Yeah. So, you know, at the moment, what I'm doing is my new documentary. Actually, I'm doing, do a plug, go to Documentary Australia Foundation. I'm crowdsourcing it. Flip side of flamboyance. It's about an insider perspective of being a 78er, maybe the youngest 78er, maybe not. But, you know, whether, you know, we're revolutionary rat bags or queer royalty icons, you know, remains to be seen then. But, you know, I think it's just about telling your story from the inside.
Mm.
And Stephen, like, how have you noticed the difference between the response to your work when you first started to the response now?
I suppose because I gave that a little bit of thought, because I saw it. Yeah, I was thinking about that. I don't know. I'm actually in rehearsal at the moment, and a new show's opening soon. And so I've been thinking about things like that and how differently my work's viewed now than earlier work. And the thing I would probably say is 25 years ago, there was a big title of the gay play. So, you know, it was a great gay play, or, you know, it sat in a genre of the gay play. And I will say that doesn't happen anymore. I've been touring quite widely 2 monologues for the last 10 years, self-performed monologues, and the third one in the trilogy is opening in November in Adelaide and going to tour. And I'm just really, really fascinated now that my work doesn't get put in that gay play box. That's a great thing in some ways, and in other ways it's like disempowering the queer voice in other ways. So I think it shows how much times have changed, because in my earlier plays it was the gay press that covered them, it was the gay audience. That is definitely not the case now. I would say that my audiences now would be very, very small gay percentage. It would mainly be theatre going audiences. And I think that's a good thing, because it means that there's an acceptance there and an interest there. All of my plays, and I've had 20 plays produced, all of my plays have got gay characters. Not necessarily gay, but LGBTQ characters, or a character is in all my plays. Always have been. It's what I write. And I will say, yeah, that there's a very big difference between 30 years ago and now. A huge difference. It's that gay play title isn't ever stamped on my work now. Is that a good thing? I don't know. What do other people think? You know, I think it's a good thing. I think the art's looked at for the art and not for the sexuality or the marginalisation or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I think there are a lot of queer writers who don't want to be put into that pigeonhole. And certainly myself, you know, I've never wanted to be labelled an Asian writer or a queer Asian writer. I am just a writer. And
well,
a lot of people would feel that.
Yeah, I never resisted it. I kind of have gone with the flow of what's happened. I never resist when I was just in gay press and just having gay audiences in the early plays. It was great. And now the audiences and the people that are interested in it are so mixed in age, in sexuality, in straight, gay, whatever, that it must be a good thing. That it never worried me at all when it was just the gay play. That was just how it was.
I think, you know, when the mainstream does DLBTIQ or queer identity, it's different. Like watching the bisexual character on The Bachelorette, I think it's a very different portrayal, and it's like, wow, this is groundbreaking. Hello, where have you been for 30 years? So I think, when the mainstream grabs something, it's like it promotes it in a way like it's first. But give us the money to do our own representations, with all the people at Mardi Gras. Wow, I want to, be able to make my work and tell my stories. And, the mainstream's very happy to film us like we're some queer peep show. But, give me the money so I can do my own representation. So, yeah, it's a plug for crowdsourcing audience out there.
Yeah, I'm really interested that what still happens. I'm really fascinated, and I'm really fascinated that reviewers will often there'll be lines that say, house rights about the seedy side of life or the seamy side of life or, the outlaws that are existing in the shadows. And to me, it's like, what the fuck? That's just normal life, So I do think...
not nefarious to me.
Yeah, it's like whatever,
life,
sex at beats or multi-partners, or I've slept with 1,000 people, like whatever. But, it's just really interesting that it makes me smile. I think it's kind of cute in a way, because I sometimes think to myself, like, seamy side of life, whatever, it's just life. But I think sometimes that queer is still portrayed as in mainstream as, this is a little bit in response to what was just said, is I think queer is still sometimes taken on board as a little bit kind of like naughty or outlawish, and I think that happens regularly. A lot of people after my monologues will ask me, mainly straight people, or I think they're straight, I don't know, but that's what the assumption I'm making, will kind of go like, wow, is that you? Was that, because most of my work now is in first person. So they'll kind of go like, wow, was that you living on the streets of Paris, having all that sex or doing all that stuff? Or, was that you? And I go, nowadays I give myself permission to go, maybe it was, and maybe it wasn't.
When people describe you as a character.
Give myself permission. Like, I don't have to fucking tell you whether that was me or not. Like, come and see the work and make your own opinions. Whereas maybe when I was younger and putting work out there, I would have gone like, yes, that was me. That was my story. But, I do think that we have the right, and some other, people have said this, we have the right to put out what we want, and we shouldn't be pushed just because we're doing work that's edgy or queer or LGBT. We shouldn't have to go like, hey, hold up a sign. Yes, this is me putting my rights forward. Like, I think we need to give ourselves permission to do it any way we want, because we can, we don't have to be pushed into a position to represent queer rights through our work if we just want to tell a story.
We are coming to the end of our time together. It's gone by really quickly, and I've enjoyed listening to all of your insights and stories. So I thought we'd just end on one more question. We've sort of tackled the past and the present today, which is fitting for a session called Queer Chronicles. So I just wanted to get your sort of ideas about what next for queer experience in art and literature and journalism even. Liz.
Really, me? I mean, that's a massive question, Chris. Well, I just think if we all just keep on doing what we're doing honestly and, together, then we might make more good things. I don't know. I don't have big answers for everybody. Sorry.
It's all good. I think that's a lovely sentiment. And Jessie, what about you?
I think in terms of journalism, in the last 5 years, I've seen so much change in terms of both what kind of stories have been going on and how people have taken them. And I guess I can see that continuing into the future. When I began as a journalist, the big story was marriage equality. We were going through the plebiscite and all of that. And that's sort of brought up all of the transphobia and the other stuff that sort of flared up during that period and has remained. But it's also opened up discussions about trans issues and intersex issues, and I'd like to see those continue to get more of a platform and more of those diverse voices being shared, more of the broader community understanding and less discrimination and all of those things that we all want. So yeah, that's what I'd like to see going forward on the journalism front and how that interacts with the community.
And Barbarella, as someone who's always sort of pushed at the boundaries, what do you think is sort of next?
Oh God, just getting up in the morning or evening and writing and, documenting my lived experience and, trying to find platforms to actually publish a lot of my unpublished work as well as fund my film. I'm a big fan of new journalism, like being, things like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, that you're a participant in your writing. I really dislike it when people say, "Oh, you're such a colourful character, Barbarella." Well, I'm actually a human being. I'm not a character, and I'm actually wearing a lot of black today. So, yeah. So just keeping on. Yeah.
And Stephen?
Yeah, I suppose when I've talked a lot about from then to now, I suppose just keep putting out all of us that fit somehow into the queer community, just keep telling our stories and putting our work out and, trusting and loving and understanding that whether we like it or not, we're falling into mainstream. And I can say from then to now that, yes, we kind of, queer is being mainstreamed in a lot of ways. And I think we just need to go with the social development of the way the world is and the acceptance that is here now, the acceptance, understanding and love that's here now that was not here when homosexuality was illegal and I was young. It's another world, and it's a good world. There's a lot of great people out there, and I think we just have to continue to believe that there are some wonderful people and that we're part of the whole world. We're not always just separate.
That is lovely. And on that note, I will bring this session to a close. Thank you so much to Enqueer for bringing us all together, and thank you to the panel for your insights today. Barbarella Karpinski, Stephen House, Liz Breslin, and Jessie Jones. You can find their work and writing online and in bookstores, so please seek it out.